1,700 years before Christ, a 17-year-old boy wakes up in a cold sweat in a tent in Canaan. He just saw sheaves of wheat bowing before his. He saw the sun, the moon, and 11 stars prostrating at his feet. And he makes the mistake that will cost his freedom. He tells the dream to his brothers. In a few weeks, this same boy will be naked inside a dry well, listening to his own brothers negotiate the price of his flesh, 20 pieces of silver. That was what an adolescent slave was worth in the market of Gilead. And that was exactly the value his brothers accepted to never see his face again. The story of Joseph does not begin with him. It begins with a father who loved too much and did not know how to hide it. Jacob had 12 sons from 4 different women, but his heart belonged to only one of them, Rachel. He worked 14 years to have her as a wife. 14 years of scorching sun, caring for flocks that were not his, all because of a face. And when Rachel finally gave birth, after years of sterility and tears, the boy who was born carried all the weight of that accumulated love. Joseph was more than a son. He was the living proof that Jacob's suffering had been worth it. The problem is that the other 11 knew this. Before we begin, write in the comments where you are watching from. Leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and activate the bell. We continue. Jacob made no point of disguising it. When Joseph turned 17, the father ordered a special tunic made for him. It was not just any clothing. The Hebrew text describes a long, colorful piece that reached the wrists and ankles. It was the type of garment used by those who did not need to work in the fields. While the older brothers pastured sheep under 40 degrees of heat, Joseph walked through the camp like a prince with his coat of many colors. The message was clear. He was different. He was the chosen one. The brothers could not even speak peacefully to Joseph. The text of Genesis uses a strong expression in Hebrew. They hated him. It was not common rivalry between brothers. It was a resentment that grew every day, fed by every look of preference that Jacob directed to Rachel's son. And then came the dreams. The first dream happened during the harvest season. Joseph saw himself and his brothers binding sheaves of wheat in the field. Suddenly, his sheaf rose and stood upright, while the brothers' sheaves bowed around it, like servants before a king. Joseph woke up, and instead of keeping that to himself, went straight to tell the family. The reaction was immediate. The brothers practically spat the words, "Will you reign over us? Will you dominate us?" The hatred increased another degree, but Joseph did not stop there. A few days later, he had another dream. This time, he saw the sun, the moon, and 11 stars prostrating before him. The images were unmistakable. The sun represented his father, the moon his mother, and the 11 stars his brothers. This time, even Jacob rebuked the sun. "Are you saying that I, your mother, and your brothers will bow before you?" The old patriarch kept those words in his heart, but the brothers kept something else. They kept a plan. The opportunity came weeks later. The 10 older brothers were pasturing the flock in Shechem, about 80 kilometers from Hebron, where the family lived. Jacob sent Joseph to verify if everything was well with them and with the sheep. The boy put on his colorful tunic and left alone. He had no idea he was walking into a trap. When the brothers saw Joseph approaching in the distance, the tunic was unmistakable. The hatred that had been fermenting for years found its chance. "Here comes the dreamer," they said among themselves. "Let us kill him and throw him into a cistern. Then we will say that a wild animal devoured him. Then we shall see what will become of his dreams." The plan was simple, murder followed by a lie, and it was almost executed. Reuben, the firstborn, intervened, not out of love for Joseph, but out of fear of the consequences. He convinced the others not to shed blood directly. The idea was to throw Joseph into an empty cistern and leave him to die of thirst. Reuben planned to return secretly later and rescue the brother, returning him to the father. But he underestimated the cruelty of the others. As soon as Joseph arrived, the brothers tore off his tunic, that coat which represented everything they hated: the father's preference, the dreams of greatness, the juvenile arrogance. They stripped the clothes from his body and threw him into a dry cistern. The pit was about 5 meters deep, smooth stone walls, no possibility of climbing. Joseph screamed, begged, cried. The brothers sat down to eat bread. This image is one of the most brutal in the Bible, not for the explicit physical violence, but for the coldness. 10 adult men eating quietly while listening to the desperate screams of their own brother echoing from within the earth. Years later, when guilt finally caught up to them, they would confess. We saw the anguish of his soul when he pleaded with us, and we did not listen. They saw, they heard, and they continued chewing. It was during this meal that Judah had an idea. A caravan of Ishmaelite merchants was passing on the road, loaded with spices and balm on the way to Egypt. Judah did the math. Killing Joseph would bring no profit, but selling him as a slave meant 20 pieces of silver divided among them. Furthermore, they would not have blood on their hands. The plan was accepted unanimously. 20 pieces of silver. It was the average price of a young slave in the ancient Middle East, the equivalent of about 2 years of wages for a common worker. The brothers pulled Joseph out of the pit, probably still screaming, still not understanding what was happening, and handed him over to the Midianite merchants. In a matter of minutes, Joseph was chained in a line of slaves, watching his own brothers count the coins and divide them among themselves. The last image he had of home was of 10 men who shared his blood, turning him into merchandise. When Reuben returned to the cistern and saw that Joseph was no longer there, he tore his clothes in despair. But it was too late. The group now needed a story to tell the father. They took Joseph's colorful tunic, killed a young goat, and dipped the fabric in the blood. Then they took the clothes to Jacob and asked with feigned innocence, "We found this. See if it is your son's tunic." Jacob recognized it immediately. He fell to his knees and let out a scream that echoed through the entire camp. "A wild animal has devoured him," he concluded. "Joseph has been torn to pieces." The patriarch of more than 100 years tore his own clothes, put on sackcloth, and entered a mourning that would last more than 2 decades. All his sons and daughters came to comfort him, but he refused any comfort. "I will go down in mourning to the grave for my son," he said. The same men who caused that pain pretended to dry it. The lie was sealed. While Jacob wept in Canaan, Joseph crossed the Sinai desert in chains. The distance between Dothan, where he was sold, and Egypt was approximately 400 kilometers. On foot, with a caravan of loaded camels, the journey took about 3 weeks. 3 weeks for Joseph to process what had happened. 3 weeks of cold nights in the desert, of miserable meals, of chains on his wrists. The boy who woke up in comfortable tents and wore prince's tunics now walked barefoot among slaves of other nations. In Egypt, Joseph was sold again. This time the buyer was a man named Potiphar, captain of Pharaoh's personal guard. He was one of the most important officers of the kingdom, responsible for palace security and the execution of state prisoners. Potiphar's house was one of the largest in Memphis, with dozens of slaves, vast agricultural properties, and direct access to the center of Egyptian power. Joseph had everything to be just another number in that structure. But something about him stood out. The biblical text says that the Lord was with Joseph and that everything he did prospered. In a few years, the Hebrew slave went from common servant to administrator of Potiphar's entire household. The Egyptian trusted Joseph so much that he concerned himself with nothing except the food he ate. All financial management, all slaves, all properties were in the hands of that young foreigner. Joseph's prosperity attracted other attention. Potiphar's wife began to notice the administrator of the house. The Hebrew text describes Joseph as someone of good appearance and handsome to behold. Day after day she tried to seduce him. Day after day he refused. Joseph knew that yielding would be a betrayal against his master and a sin against God. But the woman did not give up. The final confrontation happened when the house was empty. She grabbed Joseph by his clothes and tried to force him to lie with her. He did the only possible thing. He fled. He left his own clothing in her hands and ran outside. The woman, humiliated and furious, screamed for help. When the other servants arrived, she had already constructed her version of the story. The Hebrew slave tried to violate me. Look, he left his clothing and fled when I screamed. When Potiphar heard the accusation, his anger was kindled. Joseph was arrested immediately. There was no trial. There was no chance of defense. The word of a high-class Egyptian woman against a foreign slave had no contestation. Joseph was cast into the royal prison, the place where the king's prisoners were kept locked up. It was a subterranean dungeon, dark, damp, destined for enemies of the state. The young man who managed one of the largest houses in Egypt now shared space with criminals and conspirators. Again, Joseph had lost everything. Again, he was at the bottom of a hole. Again, he was betrayed by someone who should have treated him with justice. The tunic that Potiphar had given him as a symbol of authority was now evidence of a crime he did not commit. 13 years had already passed since he left Canaan. 13 years of slavery, hard work, and built reputation, destroyed in minutes by a lie. But not even in prison did Joseph disappear. The biblical text repeats the same formula. The Lord was with Joseph. The chief jailer began to trust him. In a short time, Joseph managed the routine of the entire prison. All prisoners answered to him. The jailer no longer supervised anything that was under the Hebrews' responsibility. It was as if an invisible force insisted on placing Joseph in positions of leadership, no matter the context. It was in this prison that two new characters entered the story. Pharaoh's chief cupbearer and chief baker fell into disgrace and were cast into the same dungeon where Joseph was. The cupbearer was responsible for serving wine to the king, a position of extreme trust, since any attempt at poisoning would pass through his hands. The baker occupied a similar post with food. Both had offended Pharaoh in some way and now awaited their fate in the darkness. One morning Joseph noticed that the two were troubled. Both had had dreams on the same night and found no one to interpret them. In ancient Egypt, dreams were considered messages from the gods. There were scribes specialized in oniric interpretation, entire libraries dedicated to the subject, but in prison there was no access to these resources. The two officers were anguished. Joseph made a statement that reveals his worldview. Interpretations belong to God. Tell me the dreams. It was not arrogance, it was faith. The same God who had given him dreams at 17 could reveal the meaning of others' dreams. The cupbearer told his first. He had seen a vine with 3 branches. The branches budded, blossomed, and produced ripe grapes. He squeezed the grapes into Pharaoh's cup and placed the cup in the king's hand. Joseph listened and answered immediately, "The 3 branches are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will restore you to your office. You will return to serving his cup as you did before." Then Joseph made a request. "Remember me when it is well with you. Speak of me to Pharaoh and get me out of this prison. I was kidnapped from the land of the Hebrews, and here also I have done nothing to deserve this dungeon." It was a desperate but dignified appeal. Joseph did not beg with tears. He presented facts, and he trusted that the cupbearer's gratitude would do the rest. The baker, encouraged by the colleague's positive interpretation, also told his dream. He carried 3 baskets of bread on his head. In the top basket, there were all kinds of baked food for Pharaoh, but the birds descended and ate everything. Joseph listened. The interpretation this time was somber. The 3 baskets are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will order you beheaded and hang your body on a post. The birds will eat your flesh. 3 days later, Pharaoh celebrated his birthday with a feast for all his officials. He sent for the cupbearer and the baker from the prison. He restored the cupbearer to his office, and he executed the baker, exactly as Joseph had said. The prophecy was fulfilled with absolute precision. But the cupbearer forgot about Joseph. 2 whole years passed, 730 days. Joseph continued in the dungeon, managing prisoners, maintaining order, waiting for a rescue that did not come. The man who should have spoken to Pharaoh was too busy serving wine to remember that Hebrew slave who interpreted his dream. Human gratitude has a short memory, until Pharaoh himself began to dream. In a single night, the king of Egypt had 2 disturbing dreams. In the first, he was by the river Nile, when 7 fat and healthy cows came out of the water and began to graze. Soon after, 7 lean and ugly cows, such as he had never seen in all the land of Egypt, came out of the same river and devoured the fat cows. But even after swallowing the 7 healthy cows, the lean ones remained as lean as before. Pharaoh woke up frightened. He slept again and had another dream. This time, he saw 7 full and good ears of grain growing on a single stalk. Then 7 withered ears, scorched by the east wind, sprouted and swallowed the good ears. Pharaoh woke up again. His mind was troubled. In the morning, the king summoned all the magicians and wise men of Egypt. It was an army of experts in dream interpretation, scribes trained for decades, priests who dedicated their lives to deciphering messages from the gods. Pharaoh told his dreams. None could interpret them. The silence of the wise men was deafening. The most powerful king on earth had received a message and could find no translator. It was then that the cupbearer finally remembered. He approached Pharaoh and confessed his failure. There was a young Hebrew in prison, servant of the captain of the guard, who had correctly interpreted his dream and the baker's 2 years earlier. Everything happened exactly as he said. Pharaoh did not hesitate. He sent for Joseph immediately. Joseph was taken in haste from the dungeon. They shaved his beard, changed his clothes, and brought him into the presence of the most powerful man in the ancient world. The contrast was absolute. On one side, Pharaoh sitting on his golden throne, surrounded by gold, linen, and incense. On the other, a 30-year-old Hebrew slave who had just come out of a subterranean prison. But Joseph did not tremble. Pharaoh was direct. "I had a dream, and no one can interpret it. I heard that you can." Joseph answered with the same conviction he had shown in prison. "It is not in me. God is the one who will give Pharaoh an answer of peace." It was not false modesty. It was the declaration of a man who had learned in 13 years of suffering that power came from another place. Pharaoh told the 2 dreams. Joseph listened in silence. And when the king finished, the interpretation came like a river. The 2 dreams are one. God is showing Pharaoh what he is about to do. The 7 good cows and the 7 good ears are 7 years. The 7 lean cows and the 7 bad ears are also 7 years. They are 7 years of famine. Joseph continued, 7 years of great plenty will come upon all the land of Egypt. After them, 7 years of famine will come, so severe that all the plenty will be forgotten. The famine will consume the land. The dream was repeated twice because the matter has already been determined by God, and God will bring it about soon. But Joseph did not stop at the interpretation. He presented a solution. Let Pharaoh select a discerning and wise man and set him over the land of Egypt. Let him appoint overseers to collect 1/5 of the harvest during the 7 years of plenty. Let them store this grain under the authority of Pharaoh. Thus the land will not perish during the famine. The plan was brilliant. 20% of all agricultural production in Egypt would be stocked in royal silos for 7 years. When the famine arrived, the country would have enough reserves to survive and even to sell to neighboring countries that would be devastated. It was a crisis management program that rivaled any modern planning. Pharaoh looked at his counselors. He looked back at Joseph. And he asked the question that would change everything. Is there anyone like this man, in whom is the Spirit of God? No one answered. Then Pharaoh addressed Joseph. Since God has revealed all this to you, there is no one as discerning and wise as you. You shall be over my house. All my people shall obey your orders. Only I on the throne will be greater than you. In a single morning, Joseph went from prisoner to governor. Pharaoh took the ring from his own finger and put it on Joseph's finger. He dressed him in robes of fine linen. He put a gold chain around his neck. He gave him the 2nd chariot of the kingdom, and heralds went before him shouting for everyone to kneel. Joseph received an Egyptian name, Zaphenath-Paneah, and a wife from the nobility, Asenath, daughter of the priest of On. At 30 years old, the Hebrew slave was now the 2nd most powerful man in the greatest empire of the time. The 7 years of plenty began exactly as Joseph had predicted. The harvests were so abundant that he stopped counting. The grain was like the sand of the sea. impossible to measure. Joseph traveled throughout Egypt, establishing storage silos in every city, collecting the surplus, preparing the nation for what was to come. During these years, his wife Asenath gave birth to 2 sons. The first he named Manasseh, which means, God has made me forget all my trouble and all my father's house. The second he named Ephraim, God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction. The names were living memorials of what Joseph had gone through. Then the plenty ended. The 7 years of famine arrived exactly as announced. The rains ceased, the Nile receded, the harvests failed. And not only in Egypt, famine spread through all the surrounding lands. Canaan, Syria, Mesopotamia. The entire region of the Fertile Crescent was devastated. But Egypt had reserves. The silos that Joseph had filled during the abundance now fed an entire nation. When the people began to starve, they cried out to Pharaoh. The king's answer was always the same: go to Joseph and do what he tells you. Joseph opened the storehouses and began to sell grain to the Egyptians, then to the foreigners who came from all parts of the ancient world in search of food. Egypt became the center of the world food trade, and Joseph was the man behind every transaction. More than 400 kilometers away in Canaan, an old patriarch of 130 years watched his flocks die and his fields dry up. Jacob heard that there was grain in Egypt. He looked at the 10 sons he had left. Benjamin, the youngest, he kept always close by, and gave the order, go down to Egypt and buy food for us so that we may live and not die. Joseph's 10 brothers departed for Egypt. 22 years had passed since they sold their younger brother for 20 pieces of silver. 22 years of secrets, of buried guilt, of sustained lies. None of them imagined they were about to encounter the consequence of their acts. When they arrived in Egypt, they were brought before the governor who controlled the sale of grain. They entered the room, and as all foreigners did, prostrated themselves with their faces to the ground. Joseph recognized the brothers immediately, but they did not recognize him. How could they? The 17-year-old adolescent they had thrown into a well was now a man of nearly 40, dressed like an Egyptian prince, speaking the language of the country, using a foreign name. The transformation was complete. The sheaves bowed. Joseph remembered the dreams. He remembered every detail, and he made a decision. He would not reveal himself yet. He needed to test those men. He needed to know if they had changed or if they remained the same ones who sold him decades ago. He began by treating them harshly. You are spies, he accused. You have come to see the nakedness of the land. The brothers denied desperately. We are honest men, sons of one father in Canaan. We were 12 brothers. The youngest is with our father, and one is no more. The mention of the brother who is no more must have cut Joseph inside. But he maintained his composure. Joseph imprisoned them for 3 days. Then he offered a proposal. One of them would remain imprisoned in Egypt while the others returned home with the grain. But they would have to bring the youngest brother, Benjamin, to prove they were not spies. If they did not bring him, they would never see the imprisoned brother again, nor buy grain in Egypt. It was at this moment that the guilt finally overflowed. Without knowing that Joseph understood Hebrew, he used an interpreter. The brothers began to speak among themselves. Surely we are being punished because of our brother. We saw the anguish of his soul when he pleaded with us, but we did not listen. That is why this distress has come upon us. Reuben was even more direct. Did I not tell you not to sin against the boy? You did not listen. Now his blood is being required of us. Joseph heard every word. He turned aside and wept. 22 years of dammed-up pain finally finding a release valve, but when he turned back to face them, his face was hard again. He ordered Simeon to be bound before them and sent the others back to Canaan. Secretly, however, Joseph ordered each man's money to be put back in his sack of grain. The brothers only discovered this when they stopped to spend the night on the way. Upon opening a sack to feed the donkeys, one of them found the silver at the top. Terror seized them all. What is this that God has done to us? When they arrived in Canaan and told everything to Jacob, the old patriarch collapsed. Joseph is no more. Simeon is not here. And now you want to take Benjamin? Everything falls upon me. Jacob refused to let Benjamin leave. He preferred to lose Simeon than to risk Rachel's last son. But the famine continued. The grain brought from Egypt ran out. The family was starving. Judah, the same one who suggested selling Joseph decades earlier, took the initiative. He promised his father that he would guard Benjamin with his own life. "If I do not bring him back, I will bear the blame before you forever." It was a transformation. The man who had sold a brother now offered his own life to protect another. Jacob finally yielded. He ordered his sons to take gifts to the governor of Egypt: balm, honey, spices, myrrh, pistachio nuts and almonds, as well as double the money to return what had been found in the sacks. And he sent Benjamin along. When Joseph saw Benjamin, the only brother who shared the same mother, he was overcome by an emotion he could barely control. He ordered a banquet prepared in his house for those men. The brothers were terrified. They thought they would be arrested because of the money. But the steward of the house reassured them. "Your God, the God of your father, put that treasure in your sacks. Your payment reached me." The banquet took place. Joseph seated the brothers in order of age, from the firstborn to the youngest. They looked at each other in astonishment. How did that Egyptian know the order? The portions of food came from Joseph's table, and Benjamin's portion was 5 times larger than the others. Joseph was testing, wanting to see if there was still envy. But the brothers ate and drank merrily with him, no sign of resentment against the favorite. The next morning, Joseph ordered the sacks filled with grain and, again, the money put back. But this time he added an instruction. His own silver cup was to be hidden in Benjamin's sack. The brothers departed without knowing of the trap. They had barely left the city when Joseph's steward overtook them. "Why have you repaid good with evil? You have stolen my master's silver cup." The brothers denied vehemently. "If the cup is found with any of us, let him die, and we the rest will be slaves." The steward agreed to a milder version. "The one with whom the cup is found shall be my slave, and the others shall be free." The search began with the oldest and ended with the youngest. When they opened Benjamin's sack, the cup was there. The brothers tore their clothes in despair and returned to the city. Before Joseph, Judah made the most eloquent speech of the entire narrative. He told of the elderly father who loved the youngest more than his own life. He explained that losing Benjamin would kill Jacob with grief. And then he offered himself. "Allow me to remain as a slave in the boy's place. Let him return with his brothers. I cannot see the misery that will fall upon my father." Joseph could stand it no longer. He ordered all the Egyptians to leave the room. When he was alone with the brothers, he began to weep so loudly that the Egyptians outside heard it. Between sobs, he said in Hebrew, "I am Joseph. Is my father still alive?" The brothers were paralyzed with terror. They could not speak. The brother they sold as a slave was now the man who controlled whether they lived or died. Joseph called them closer. "I am Joseph, your brother, the one you sold into Egypt. But do not be distressed or blame yourselves for having sold me here. It was to preserve lives that God sent me before you. The famine has lasted 2 years, and there will still be 5 more without plowing or harvesting. God sent me before you to preserve a remnant on the earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance." It was total forgiveness. Not just forgiveness, but reinterpretation. Joseph saw the hand of God operating through the worst human choices. The well, the slavery, the prison, the slander, everything had been directed toward this moment. "You planned evil against me, but God turned it into good." Joseph embraced Benjamin and wept. He kissed all the brothers and wept over each of them. The sound of the weeping reached Pharaoh's palace. The king sent word to Joseph, "Bring your father and all the family to Egypt. I will give you the best of the land. Do not worry about your belongings, because the best of all Egypt will be yours." Jacob, upon hearing that Joseph was alive, could not believe it. His heart became numb. But when he saw the wagons that Joseph had sent to transport him, his spirit revived. "It is enough," he said. "Joseph, my son, is still alive. I will go and see him before I die." Jacob's entire family went down to Egypt, 70 people, counting sons, grandsons, and great-grandsons. Joseph went to meet his father in Goshen. When they finally saw each other, they embraced and wept for a long time. Jacob said, "Now I can die, since I have seen your face and know that you are still alive." The Hebrews settled in Goshen, the most fertile region of the Nile Delta. Joseph continued administering Egypt during the remaining years of famine. Jacob lived another 17 years in the land of his sons before dying, at 147 years old. Before departing, he blessed each of the 12, including Joseph's 2 sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, who were adopted as tribes of Israel. Joseph died at 110 years old in Egypt, but he asked that his bones not remain there. He made his brothers swear that when God visited the people of Israel, they would carry his remains back to Canaan. 400 years later, when Moses led the Exodus, Joseph's bones went along. They crossed the Red Sea, crossed the desert, and only found rest in the Promised Land. But Joseph's legacy goes beyond transported bones. He is the most complete portrait of Christ in the entire Old Testament, loved by the Father, hated by the brothers, sold for pieces of silver, falsely accused, humiliated before being exalted. And in the end, the one who was rejected became the only one capable of saving those who betrayed him. When Jesus said that the Scriptures spoke of him, Joseph was part of that story. The boy who dreamed was not delirious. He was seeing the future with eyes that God had opened.